Close your eyes for a moment. Picture a woman kneeling in prayer. She wears a simple black habit. Her head is covered. Her hands are clasped, fingers intertwined, knuckles white from gripping so hard. Around her, other women, her sisters in Christ, are doing the same. Some are crying. Some are silent. All of them know what's coming. Outside the convent walls, they can hear it, screaming. The crash of doors being smashed open. The thunder of thousands of boots on cobblestone streets. The roar of soldiers drunk on victory. It's May 29th, 1453. Constantinople, the greatest Christian city in the world, has just fallen to the Ottoman Empire. And these nuns, women who devoted their entire lives to God, who took sacred vows of chastity and obedience, are about to discover that their religious vows mean nothing to the men breaking down their doors. Some of these women will be dead within hours. Others will wish they were. What I'm about to tell you isn't speculation. It isn't propaganda. Every detail comes directly from eyewitness accounts written by people who were there: Catholic archbishops, Byzantine officials, Venetian merchants, even Ottoman historians. These are documented facts, preserved in letters, diaries, and official records that survived for over 570 years. The story is so horrific that historians downplayed it for centuries. But these women deserve to have their true story told. If you want history told without censorship, the documented truth that classrooms won't teach, hit that subscribe button now. Let me show you what really happened to the nuns of Byzantium. Before we discuss what happened to them, you need to understand who these women were. In medieval Byzantium, convents weren't refuges for the desperate or destitute. They were sophisticated religious institutions that housed some of the most educated, influential women in the empire. Byzantine nuns came primarily from three backgrounds. First, aristocratic daughters. Noble families often placed younger daughters in convents as an honorable alternative to marriage. These women brought substantial dowries to their religious houses, funding the construction of elaborate churches, libraries, and charitable institutions. Second, widows of officials. When a Byzantine nobleman died, his widow often entered a convent, partly for spiritual reasons, partly for practical protection. A widow in a convent maintained her dignity and avoided pressure to remarry. Third, educated women. Byzantium valued female literacy far more than Western Europe. Nuns could read Greek, studied scripture, copied manuscripts, and some even wrote theological treatises. They were intellectuals. When a Byzantine woman took monastic vows, she underwent a sacred ceremony second only to marriage in its solemnity. She was considered a bride of Christ, quite literally married to God. The vows included chastity, complete sexual abstinence for life. This wasn't just a rule. It was their identity. Violating this vow, whether willingly or by force, was understood as spiritual death. Obedience to the abbess of her convent and to church authority. Their lives followed strict schedules of prayer, work, and study. Poverty, personal ownership of nothing. Everything belonged to the community. And in closure, many nuns, especially those in stricter orders, lived behind walls they would never cross again in their lives. The convent was their entire world. Let me walk you through a typical day for a Byzantine nun. 3 in the morning. She rises for matins, morning prayers. The stone floor is cold beneath her bare feet. Her breath mists in the darkness. She pulls on her black habit, covers her hair, finds her place in the chapel with her sisters. Dawn. Additional prayers and scripture reading. The words of the Psalms echo off stone walls that have heard these same prayers for centuries. Morning. Work begins. Some nuns copy manuscripts, their fingers stained with ink, bent over desks in the scriptorium. Others weave. Others maintain the convent gardens. Others teach novices the prayers, the hymns, the rhythm of religious life. Midday. A simple meal. Often just bread, vegetables, and water. They eat in silence, while one sister reads aloud from scripture or the lives of the saints. Afternoon. More prayer and work. The hours marked not by clocks, but by bells, by the sun's movement across the sky. Evening. Vespers, the evening prayer service. their voices rising together in the chapel, creating something beautiful for God. Night. Compline. The final prayers before sleep, asking God's protection through the darkness. This wasn't an easy life. It was disciplined, austere, and demanding. But it was theirs, chosen meaningful, and conducted in community with women who understood them. By 1453, Constantinople had dozens of convents. Some were small houses with a handful of nuns. Others were vast complexes with hundreds of women, elaborate churches, libraries, hospitals, and schools. The most famous included the Convent of Lips, founded by an empress, one of the wealthiest religious institutions in the city, known for its charity to the poor and its stunning architecture. The Convent of St. John the Baptist, located near the imperial palace, housed many women from the imperial family and highest nobility, and numerous smaller foundations scattered throughout the city's neighborhoods, each with its own chapel, dormitories, and gardens. These weren't just buildings. They were entire communities. Some had existed for centuries, with generations of women having lived, prayed, and died within their walls. Understanding who these women were is crucial to understanding what was taken from them. These weren't anonymous peasants swept up in war. They were educated, devout women who had chosen this life. They had families, parents, siblings, nephews, and nieces. They had names, personalities, talents. They wrote letters, composed hymns, painted icons, taught children, and they had built their entire identities around their relationship with God and their sacred vows. When Ottoman soldiers broke into their convents on May 29, 1453, they weren't just violating women's bodies. They were destroying identities, shattering religious communities that had existed for centuries, and desecrating everything these women held sacred. Now you understand who they were. Let me tell you what happened to them. At approximately 1:30 in the morning, Ottoman forces breached the Theodosian walls. By dawn, Byzantine resistance had collapsed. By mid-morning, Ottoman soldiers controlled most of the city. Archbishop Leonardo of Chios, a Catholic prelate who witnessed everything, was in Constantinople that morning. His letter to Pope Nicholas V, written weeks later, provides our most detailed eyewitness account of what happened specifically to nuns. He writes, and I'm translating from the Latin, "The nuns left behind, even those who were obviously such, were disgraced with foul debaucheries." Let me stop there. Even those who were obviously such. That phrase is crucial. Byzantine nuns wore distinctive habits, black or dark robes, head coverings that identified them as religious women. Ottoman soldiers knew these were nuns. They weren't mistaken about who they were attacking. Why does this matter? Because it means the violation of nuns wasn't accidental collateral damage. It was targeted. Several factors made nuns specific targets. First, symbolic value. Raping a bride of Christ was an ultimate assertion of conquest, not just over bodies, but over the Christian faith itself. It demonstrated that God had abandoned these women. Second, perceived purity. The cultural value placed on virgin nuns made them desirable to soldiers who believed they were taking something particularly precious. Third, accessibility. Unlike noble women who might have guards or might have fled, nuns were concentrated in known locations, convents, and had nowhere to run. They were easy prey. Fourth, economic value. As we'll discuss later, educated women from good families commanded high prices in slave markets. Nuns fit this profile perfectly. Ottoman military tradition granted soldiers 3 days of unrestricted pillaging after taking a city by force. This wasn't chaos. It was policy, designed to motivate troops who fought for plunder rather than wages. During those 3 days, soldiers moved systematically through Constantinople, breaking into every building with potential loot or captives. When they reached the convents, several things happened in rapid succession. First, the doors were broken down. Convent gates, designed to keep the world out and preserve enclosure, were smashed with axes or battering rams. The first barrier was physical, and it took minutes to overcome. Second, the nuns were rounded up. Soldiers moved through dormitories, chapels, and gardens, gathering the women. Some nuns tried to hide, in cellars, in attics, behind altars. Contemporary accounts mention soldiers searching every space. Third, immediate violence. Many nuns were raped on the spot, in their own convents, in their chapels, sometimes within sight of crucifixes and icons. Leonardo's phrase, disgraced with foul debaucheries, is 15th century language for mass sexual violence. Fourth, separation and claiming. After the initial assault, soldiers began claiming individual nuns as personal captives. Ottoman military tradition allowed a soldier to keep any captive he secured, meaning if he could get her to a safe location, she became his property to sell or keep. Not all nuns were young. Convents housed women of all ages, from novices in their teens to elderly women who had spent 50 or 60 years in religious life. What happened to the old nuns? Leonardo writes that many elderly women were simply killed. They had no economic value as slaves, couldn't perform physical labor, and weren't sexually desirable to soldiers seeking plunder. Archaeological evidence from mass graves in Constantinople dated to 1453 includes skeletal remains of elderly women showing signs of violent death, slashed skulls, broken bones consistent with being beaten or thrown from heights. The old women who had spent their entire lives in prayer were murdered and left in the streets. For younger nuns, women roughly aged 15 to 35, what happened was different but equally horrific. These women were merchandise. Niccolò Barbaro, the Venetian surgeon who documented the siege in his diary, specifically mentions nuns among the captives. He writes, they sought out the monasteries, and all the nuns were led to the fleet and ravished and abused by the Turks, and then sold at auction for slaves throughout Turkey. Notice the sequence. Ravished and abused happened first. Then they were sold at auction. This means many nuns were raped by the soldiers who captured them, then sold to different owners who would rape them again. The sexual violence was both immediate, as a reward to conquering soldiers, and ongoing as part of their enslavement. While we don't have detailed records of every convent's fate, some specific mentions survive. A monastery near the Hagia Sophia. Multiple sources mention soldiers breaking into a women's religious house very close to the great cathedral. The nuns had barricaded themselves inside, praying for divine intervention. When soldiers finally broke through, they found dozens of women huddled together. All were taken. The Convent of Lips. This famous institution, founded by Empress Theodora Paleologina, was thoroughly looted. While specific details of what happened to its nuns aren't preserved, we know the building was ransacked, its treasures taken, and it was later converted into a mosque, suggesting Ottoman soldiers had complete access. Neighborhood convents. Smaller establishments throughout the city's residential districts were broken into during house-to-house searches. These attacks were less documented because they involved fewer women and less valuable properties. But contemporary accounts make clear that no convent was spared. A handful of nuns survived to give testimony, either because they were ransomed quickly by family or because they managed to escape during the chaos. One account, preserved in a 16th century compilation of survivor testimonies, describes a nun who hid in a cistern beneath her convent for 2 days. When she emerged, she found her sisters gone and the building desecrated. Icons smashed, religious texts torn apart, the chapel converted into a temporary stable for horses. Another survivor, ransomed by her brother who was a merchant who had fled before the siege, testified that during her captivity, she was kept with approximately 30 other women from her convent. They were held in a warehouse near the harbor for several days before being separated for sale. She never saw her sisters again. For these women, the physical violation was only part of the trauma. Remember, their entire identity was built on being brides of Christ. Their chastity wasn't just a rule, it was who they were. Byzantine theology taught that a nun who lost her virginity, even by force, was spiritually compromised. While the Church officially taught that rape didn't constitute sin because there was no consent, the cultural reality was more complex. Some religious authorities suggested raped nuns should do penance. Some women internalized the belief that they were now ruined. Imagine this. You have devoted your entire life to God. You have kept yourself pure for decades. And now, in a single morning, everything you believed made you holy has been violently taken. You're still alive. Your heart still beats. But are you still a bride of Christ? Or are you now just a slave who used to be holy? This spiritual anguish, this destruction of identity, was, for many nuns, worse than the physical pain. The Hagia Sophia wasn't just a church. It was the symbol of Byzantine Christianity, a massive domed cathedral that had stood for nearly 1,000 years, the site of imperial coronations, the heart of Orthodox Christian worship. When Constantinople fell, thousands of civilians fled to the Hagia Sophia, believing it would be a sanctuary. They believed God would protect those who sheltered in his house. Among those thousands were nuns. George Francis, a Byzantine official who survived the conquest, recorded what happened at the Hagia Sophia. He writes, "One Turk would look for the captive who seemed the wealthiest. A second would prefer a pretty face among the nuns. Each rapacious Turk was eager to lead his captive to a safe place, and then return to secure a second and a third prize." He specifically mentions nuns, a pretty face among the nuns, as being selected by soldiers. Let me walk you through what this means. In medieval warfare, churches were supposed to be sanctuaries. Both Christian and Muslim military traditions recognized that houses of worship should be respected, that people sheltering in them should be spared. The Ottoman soldiers ignored this completely. When they broke down the bronze doors of the Hagia Sophia, they found families pressed together in terror. Priests still holding crosses and conducting liturgy. Nuns kneeling in prayer before the altar. Children crying. Elderly people too weak to flee. The soldiers moved through them like shoppers at a market. Francis' account describes a process. Soldiers would move through the crowd, selecting captives based on perceived value. For nuns, this selection was particularly deliberate. Their distinctive clothing made them identifiable, and soldiers knew educated women from good families could be sold for high prices. The process worked like this. First, visual selection. A soldier would spot a nun who appeared young and healthy, meaning she'd survived the journey to slave markets and could work. Second, physical claiming. He would grab her, sometimes literally dragging her away from other refugees. Third, securing the captive. He'd take her outside or to a secured area where other soldiers couldn't steal his prize. Fourth, returning for more. If there were still unclaimed captives, the soldier would go back for a second and a third prize. This wasn't random violence. It was systematic extraction of human merchandise. We have testimony from several survivors describing what happened to religious women specifically. Immediate violence within the church. Multiple accounts mention soldiers raping women inside the Hagia Sophia itself, against pillars, on the floor, within sight of the altar. For nuns, this was particularly devastating. They were being violated in the holiest place they knew, in front of icons of Christ and Mary, while other captives watched. Separation from other captives. After the initial assault, soldiers began organizing their prisoners. Nuns were often separated from lay captives because they had different market value. One survivor described watching a group of about 20 nuns, still in their habits, being led out of the church in a line, bound together with ropes. The last liturgy. One particularly haunting detail. When soldiers first entered, some priests tried to continue the divine liturgy, the Orthodox Mass, believing that as long as worship continued, God might still intervene. Nuns who were part of this final liturgy continued singing hymns even as soldiers moved among them, selecting captives. The singing stopped only when the soldiers began dragging people away. Even Critobulus of Imbris, a Greek historian who later worked for M2 and generally praised the Sultan, couldn't completely whitewash what happened. He writes, "High-born women, young and gentle girls of noble family, now naked under their long hair, fell thus into slavery." Naked under their long hair, meaning their clothing had been torn off. High-born women, meaning aristocrats and nuns who came from noble families. Even the Ottoman-friendly historian admits that well-born women, almost certainly including nuns, were stripped and enslaved. For Byzantine nuns, the Hagia Sophia was more than a building. It represented the presence of God on earth, the protection of the Virgin Mary, the continuity of Christian civilization going back to Constantine the Great. To be violated inside the Hagia Sophia meant witnessing the failure of everything they believed. If God wouldn't protect his brides in his own house, where he had been worshipped for a millennium, then either God had abandoned them or God was powerless against the Ottomans. Either conclusion was spiritually devastating. Nuns later reported, in testimony given after being ransomed, that losing their faith was worse than losing their freedom. They couldn't pray anymore. The words felt meaningless. How do you pray to a God who watched you be raped on the floor of his greatest church and did nothing? This spiritual death, this loss of the faith that had defined their entire existence, was, for many, the worst thing the Ottomans did to them. Worse than the physical pain. Worse than the enslavement. Worse than anything. After 3 days of pillaging, Ottoman forces began organizing their captives. What happened next transformed nuns from religious women into commodities. Nicolo Barbaro documents what happened. He writes, all the nuns were led to the fleet and ravished and abused by the Turks, and then sold at auction for slaves throughout Turkey. Let me break down this process step by step, because understanding the mechanics shows how systematically these women were dehumanized. Captives were marched or carried to collection points, often near the harbor or military camps. The journey itself was traumatic. Nuns, many still wearing torn habits, were bound with ropes and forced to walk through streets filled with corpses, burning buildings, and looting soldiers. Some accounts describe nuns being transported in groups from their convents directly to the fleet, Ottoman ships anchored in the Golden Horn and Bosphorus. They were held in the holds of these ships, in darkness, for days or weeks as more captives were collected. Before sale, captives underwent processing, a procedure designed to assess their market value. For nuns, this involved physical examination. Buyers wanted to verify health, age, and physical condition. This meant nuns were stripped naked and examined like livestock. Teeth were checked. Dental health indicated overall health and age. Hair was inspected for lice. Bodies were assessed for disease, scars, or defects that might reduce value. Skill assessment. Could they read? Write? Sew? Speak multiple languages? These skills increased value, and nuns, being generally educated, scored high here. But demonstrating these skills required interrogation, often through interpreters. That was itself psychologically traumatic. Categorization. Based on these assessments, nuns were categorized for different markets. Premium category. Young, attractive, educated women from noble families, highest prices, sold to wealthy households or imperial officials. Standard category. Middle-aged women with useful skills, moderate prices, sold for domestic labor. Low-value category. Older, less healthy, or uneducated women, sold cheaply or sometimes killed if deemed unsellable. The day after the fall of Constantinople, slave auctions began. Ottoman military regulations specified that 20% of all plunder, including slaves, went to the Sultan. The remaining 80% could be kept or sold by the soldiers who had captured them. This created a massive market. With approximately 60,000 captives, thousands were being sold simultaneously in different locations across the city. The auction process worked like this. Display. Captives were brought out, sometimes on raised platforms, where potential buyers could examine them. For nuns, still wearing identifiable religious clothing, if it hadn't been completely torn away, their identity as holy women was visible to everyone. There was no hiding what they had been. Bidding. Buyers called out prices. For attractive young nuns from known noble families, bidding could be fierce. These were valuable commodities. For others, prices were low. Sale. Once a price was agreed, the transaction was recorded. Ottoman tax officials needed documentation to collect their share. The nun was handed over to her new owner, who could do whatever he wanted with her. We need to understand the economics. Nuns weren't just random captives. They had specific value in the Ottoman slave market. Education. Most Byzantine nuns could read and write Greek, often Latin, sometimes Arabic. In a society where female literacy was rare, this was valuable. An educated slave could manage household accounts, teach children, or serve as a secretary. Premium prices. Noble birth. Many nuns came from aristocratic families. They had been raised with manners, cultural refinement, knowledge of court etiquette. For an Ottoman official trying to demonstrate sophistication, owning a Byzantine noblewoman as a domestic slave was a status symbol. Sexual value. Despite taking vows of chastity, nuns' youth made them desirable for harems. The fact that they were religious women added a layer of taboo appeal for some buyers. The corruption of Christian holiness. Religious curiosity. Some Ottoman intellectuals purchased Christian nuns out of genuine curiosity about Byzantine religious life, keeping them as domestic slaves who might discuss theology or translate Christian texts. This sounds almost benign until you remember they were still slaves, still forced, still owned. We have some documented prices from Ottoman tax registers that recorded slave transactions. In the immediate aftermath of Constantinople's fall, prices collapsed due to oversupply. With 60,000 captives flooding the market, even valuable slaves sold cheaply. A young, educated woman who might normally sell for 50 to 80 gold coins sold for 10 to 20 gold coins. Some captives sold for as little as a single coin, less than the price of a good meal. But within weeks, as captives were dispersed and supply decreased, prices rose. By June 1453, a Byzantine nun with documented noble heritage could sell for over 100 gold coins, roughly equivalent to several months' wages for a skilled craftsman. Think about that. A woman's entire life, her identity, her body, her future, reduced to a price tag. After purchase, nuns were dispersed across the Ottoman Empire. Constantinople households. Many remained in the conquered city, now owned by Ottoman officials who moved into former Byzantine mansions. These nuns might recognize streets where they'd once walked in their religious processions, now walking as slaves to fetch water or cook meals for their owner's family. Anatolia. Thousands of captives were transported into Asia Minor, to cities like Bursa, Adrianople, or Konya. For a nun from Constantinople, this was like being taken to another planet. Different language, different culture, hundreds of miles from anything familiar. The imperial palace. Some nuns ended up in the Sultan's palace complex, though not necessarily in the Sultan's personal harem. The palace employed hundreds of slave women for various tasks, from cooking to cleaning to serving as attendants. Being palace slave sounds prestigious, but it meant living in a massive, strictly controlled institution where escape was impossible. Beyond the empire. Some nuns were resold to traders who exported slaves further, to Egypt, Syria, North Africa, even Persia. These women disappeared completely from historical record. No family could ransom them. No one knew where they'd gone. They simply vanished into the vastness of the Islamic world. Here's what's crucial to understand. For most enslaved nuns, there was no rescue, no ransom, no return. Byzantine families were themselves devastated by the conquest. Many nobles were killed or fled penniless. Those with money might ransom one family member, but they couldn't afford to ransom every enslaved nun from a convent. The Catholic Church occasionally negotiated ransom of clergy, but nuns, being Orthodox Christians, weren't their priority. And the Orthodox Church, now under Ottoman control, had no power to negotiate. So the vast majority of these women remained slaves for the rest of their lives. Some eventually converted to Islam, which provided legal benefits and sometimes led to manumission. Some died in slavery. Some bore children to their owners, creating the next generation. But their lives as nuns, their identities as holy women devoted to God, ended on May 29, 1453. That identity was murdered even though their bodies survived. Niccolò Barbaro's diary contains a passage that haunts everyone who reads it. He writes, "Some of them preferred to cast themselves into the wells and drown rather than fall into the hands of the Turks." Multiple nuns chose death over capture. Let that sink in. These weren't impulsive suicides in a moment of panic. These women made calculated decisions. Drowning was preferable to what awaited them. Wells were common in Constantinople. Every neighborhood, every monastery had them. They were deep, stone-lined shafts, often 20 to 30 feet to the water, then water deep enough to drown in. When nuns heard soldiers breaking down convent doors, when they saw their sisters being dragged away, some ran to these wells and climbed in. The death wouldn't have been quick or easy. Climbing down a narrow shaft in darkness, then dropping into cold water, struggling as your heavy wool habit soaked through and pulled you under, lungs burning, finally drowning. It was a horrible death, but it was their choice. And that autonomy, that final exercise of free will, was the last thing they had control over. This is important. In Christian theology, suicide is a mortal sin. These women knew this. They had spent years studying scripture and church teaching. They understood that choosing death over captivity might damn their souls eternally. They did it anyway. What does that tell you about what they thought awaited them? If eternal damnation was preferable to Ottoman captivity, how bad must that captivity have been? Wells weren't the only method. Contemporary accounts mention jumping from heights. Some nuns threw themselves from convent walls or windows. Constantinople's hilly geography meant many buildings had significant drops. Several accounts mention women's bodies found broken on rocks or cobblestones below monastery walls. Self-starvation. A few captive nuns who couldn't escape physically chose to stop eating. Starving to death takes weeks and is agonizing. But some women chose this rather than participate in their own enslavement. Ottoman owners sometimes force-feeding, but some women managed to resist until death. Provoking execution. One account describes a nun who, after being captured, deliberately blasphemed against Islam in front of her captor. In Ottoman law, insulting the Prophet Muhammad was a capital offense. She was executed, which may have been exactly what she wanted. Death by execution rather than a lifetime of slavery. One account, preserved in a 16th century Orthodox martyrology, tells of an unnamed abbess, a mother superior, of a convent in Constantinople. When soldiers broke into her convent, she was in the chapel with approximately 30 younger nuns. As soldiers entered, she reportedly stood between them and her nuns, declaring that they would have to kill her first before touching her spiritual daughters. The soldiers killed her. Then they took the nuns anyway. Was her sacrifice pointless? From a practical perspective, yes, she died and the nuns were still enslaved. But from a spiritual perspective, she maintained her vow of care for her community until the very moment of death. She chose to die as an abbess rather than live as a slave. Here's something that haunts me about the drowning accounts. Barbaro uses plural, wells, not a well. Multiple nuns made this same choice in different locations. Imagine this. Across Constantinople, in different neighborhoods, in convents that had no communication with each other, individual nuns independently reached the same conclusion. Without consulting each other, without planning, they all decided drowning was better than capture. That's not coincidence. That's a shared understanding of what Ottoman slavery meant for women, especially for religious women whose entire identity was built on vows that were about to be violently destroyed. What happened to the bodies? Some remained in the wells for days or weeks until someone pulled them out, often after the water was needed. Imagine being forced to retrieve your sister's drowned body because your new master wanted water. Others were left where they fell from heights, sometimes as warnings. Some accounts mention corpses of nuns being left visible in the streets as reminders of Ottoman victory. There were no proper burials, no funeral liturgies, no tombstones marking their graves. These women who had devoted their lives to religious ritual died without the last rites they'd spent decades preparing to receive. Even in death, they were robbed. This is the question that haunts historians. Were the nuns who chose death making a rational decision? Based on what we know about Ottoman slavery, about the specific treatment of religious captives, about the destruction of identity that enslavement entailed, I'd argue yes. For women whose identity, purpose, and sense of self were entirely bound up in their religious vows and community, slavery wasn't just physical bondage. It was existential annihilation. They wouldn't just lose their freedom. They'd lose themselves. The nuns in those wells understood something modern people struggle to grasp. Sometimes survival isn't the same as living. Sometimes continuing to exist in a state that destroys everything you are is worse than ceasing to exist entirely. They chose non-existence over that destruction. And honestly, given what awaited them, I can't say they were wrong. Not all nuns chose death. Most, whether from hope, fear, or simply the survival instinct, lived. What was life like for a Byzantine nun enslaved in the Ottoman Empire? We have testimony from a few women who were eventually ransomed and returned to Byzantine communities outside Ottoman control. Their accounts, preserved in church records and personal letters, give us glimpses into this nightmare. Multiple ransomed nuns described their first night in captivity with nearly identical language, suggesting this was a universal experience. After being purchased, the nun would be taken to her new owner's house. She would be given new clothes. Her habit was often taken away, eliminating the visible sign of her religious identity. She would be assigned sleeping quarters, usually with other slaves. And then, in most cases, the owner or one of his male relatives would come to her. Remember this. Under Islamic law, as practiced in the Ottoman Empire, a man had complete sexual access to his female slaves. Marriage wasn't required. Consent wasn't required. A slave woman couldn't legally refuse. For a nun whose entire identity was built on chastity, this was spiritual death. One testimony describes a ransomed nun saying she died that first night, even though she continued breathing for 15 more years before ransom. She meant she stopped being who she was. The woman who had been a bride of Christ ceased to exist. What did enslaved nuns do day to day? Domestic labor, cleaning, cooking, weaving, childcare, the basic work of a household. For women who had spent years in contemplative prayer and manuscript copying, this wasn't just physically demanding, it was spiritually crushing. Their time was no longer their own for prayer. Sexual availability. For attractive younger nuns, this was often their primary purpose. They were kept as concubines, expected to be sexually available whenever their owner desired. Some bore children, which created impossible psychological situations. How do you love a child conceived through rape by the man who enslaved you? Teaching. Educated nuns were sometimes used to teach their owners' children to read, write, or speak Greek. This created a terrible irony. They were using the education they'd gained in a convent to serve the children of the men who'd destroyed their convents. Display. Some wealthy Ottomans kept educated Byzantine slaves partially as status symbols, proof of their sophistication and conquest victory. Nuns might be trotted out when important guests visited to demonstrate the owner's cultured household. For nuns, the inability to practice their faith was its own torture. In Byzantine monasteries, prayer was constant, 7 liturgical hours, private devotions, feast day celebrations, scripture reading. Prayer structured every moment of a nun's day. In Ottoman households, this was impossible. No churches. Slaves couldn't leave the house freely to attend services. Even if they could, many were far from any Christian church. No liturgical books. Their prayer books, missals, and scripture copies had been left behind or destroyed. They had to pray from memory, if they dared pray at all. No community. In convents, prayer was communal. Nuns sang together, prayed together, supported each other. Enslaved individually in separate households, they were isolated. Active suppression. Some owners forbade Christian practice entirely, punishing slaves who prayed openly. Others pressured slaves to convert to Islam through a combination of incentives, legal benefits, possible manumission, and punishment. One testimony describes a ransomed nun saying she had forgotten how to pray because during her 8 years of slavery, she'd been forbidden to make the sign of the cross or speak the name of Christ aloud. Her religious practice became entirely internal, and eventually even that faded, like a language she no longer spoke. A significant number of enslaved Christian women, including nuns, eventually converted to Islam. Was this choice or coercion? The answer is complicated. Legal pressure. Under Ottoman law, Muslim slaves had more legal rights than Christian slaves. A converted slave might be manumitted, freed, after a set period. Christian slaves had no such guarantee. This created enormous pressure to convert. Social pressure. Some owners actively encouraged conversion through rewards, better treatment, or promises of eventual freedom. Others used punishment, beatings, denial of food, isolation. Spiritual despair. Some nuns converted because they'd lost their faith entirely. If God had abandoned them, why maintain loyalty to Him? Conversion became a way of accepting their new reality. For some, conversion was purely strategic, an external performance, while maintaining Christian belief internally. But sustaining this dual identity for years or decades was psychologically exhausting. Whatever the motivation, conversion was often experienced as another death, the death of the religious identity they'd spent their whole lives building. Enslaved nuns who bore children to their owners faced impossible situations. Byzantine religious teaching said children born of rape were innocent and should be loved. But these weren't just children of rape. They were children of enslavement, often raised Muslim, who might not even know their mother had been a Christian nun. Some ransomed nuns reported the anguish of being separated from children when they were freed. Ottoman law allowed owners to keep the children of female slaves. Imagine this. You spend years enslaved, you bear children, and when you're finally ransomed, you must choose between freedom and your children. Some women chose to remain enslaved rather than abandon their children. Others left, carrying the trauma of that choice for the rest of their lives. A tiny number of enslaved nuns managed to escape. These stories are rare, which tells you how difficult escape was. One account describes a nun who was purchased by a merchant in Bursa, but ran away during a trip to Constantinople, where she contacted the Genoese community in Galata. The Genoese had remained independent. They sheltered her until she could be smuggled onto a ship to Italy. Another testimony tells of a nun who learned Turkish well enough to convince her owner she'd converted to Islam. He granted her more freedom of movement, which she used to contact the underground Orthodox Christian community in Constantinople. They arranged for her to hide in a church, then escape via a sympathetic ship captain. But for every escape story, there are thousands of women who died in slavery, having never seen freedom again. The physical suffering was terrible. But for nuns, the spiritual suffering was worse. These women had built their entire identity on being brides of Christ, on their relationship with God, on their community of sisters. All of that was stripped away. They couldn't pray freely. They couldn't attend liturgy. They had no spiritual guidance. They were sexually violated repeatedly, destroying their vow of chastity. They were forced to serve the very people who destroyed their world. Many reported, in testimonies given after ransom, that they felt damned. They felt God had abandoned them. They felt they were no longer truly Christian because they'd been so thoroughly polluted. The psychological term for this is spiritual injury, damage to one's sense of meaning, identity, and relationship with the sacred. For Byzantine nuns, this injury was total. In a very real sense, the women who came out of Ottoman slavery were not the same women who went in. The nuns died in captivity, even though the bodies survived. What happened to Byzantine nuns during the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople is documented historical fact. We have eyewitness testimony from multiple sources. Leonard of Chios, who was there and wrote to the Pope. Niccolò Barbaro, who kept a detailed diary throughout the siege. George Francis, a Byzantine official who survived. Even Critobulus of Imbris, who worked for Mem II and tried to present the Ottomans favorably, couldn't hide what happened. We have Ottoman tax records documenting slave sales. We have testimony from ransomed survivors. We have archaeological evidence. We have contemporary letters and official correspondence. This isn't propaganda. It isn't exaggeration. It happened. For centuries, this story was downplayed or sanitized. Textbooks mention the fall of Constantinople, but rarely discuss what fall meant for the women of the city. The focus is on military tactics, geopolitics, the end of the Byzantine Empire. But history isn't just about emperors and generals. It's about the nuns praying in their convents when the doors were smashed. It's about the women who jumped into wells rather than face what was coming. It's about the enslaved religious women who spent decades in captivity, their identities destroyed, their faith shattered. They deserve to have their story told accurately. You might wonder, why focus on nuns rather than all women who suffered during the conquest? Because, for nuns, the violation was total in a way it wasn't for other women. Identity destruction. Lay women who were enslaved lost their freedom, but nuns lost their entire identity. Being a nun wasn't just what they did, it was who they were. The violation of their chastity vows wasn't just physical. It destroyed the religious identity they'd spent years building. Convents that had existed for centuries were emptied in a single day. Entire religious communities, with their traditions, prayers, and collective memory, ceased to exist. Nuns represented the sacred brides of Christ, holy women. Their violation was an assault on the sacred itself, a demonstration that nothing was protected, nothing was holy enough to escape conquest. Let me be absolutely clear about this. This history is not an excuse for prejudice against modern Turkish people or Muslims. The Ottoman Empire was a complex, multi-ethnic imperial system. Not all Turks participated in these conquests. Not all Muslims supported these policies. Many Ottoman officials later tried to mitigate some of the worst aspects of the slave system. More importantly, conquest atrocities were universal in this era. This isn't about indicting one culture or religion. It's about documenting what happened to specific women in specific historical circumstances. Using this history to justify modern bigotry would be as wrong as blaming modern Italians for what the Romans did. We owe the nuns of Byzantium 3 things. First, accurate memory. Their story should be told truthfully, based on primary sources, without sensationalism or fabrication. Second, recognition of their humanity. They weren't just statistics or abstract victims. They were individual women with names, personalities, families, hopes, and faith. Third, acknowledgement of their resistance. Some chose death rather than slavery. Others survived with incredible resilience. Both responses deserve respect. Were the nuns who drowned themselves right? Was what awaited them truly worse than death? Based on the documented evidence of what happened to enslaved nuns, the physical violence, the spiritual destruction, the obliteration of identity, the lifetime of captivity, I believe they were making a rational assessment. For women whose entire existence was built on their relationship with God and their religious community, survival in a state that destroyed both wasn't really survival at all. They chose to die as nuns, maintaining their identity and their vows until their final breath, rather than live as slaves who used to be nuns. That choice deserves to be understood and honored, not dismissed or sensationalized. On May 29, 1453, the sun rose over Constantinople for the last time as a Christian city. In convents across the city, nuns gathered for morning prayers, their voices rising in the darkness, singing the same hymns their predecessors had sung for centuries. By noon, those voices were silenced. Some forever in death, others in slavery, their identities destroyed even as their bodies survived. We don't know most of their names. We don't know their faces. We don't know what they dreamed about, what made them laugh, what they prayed for in their private moments. But we know they existed. We know what happened to them. And we know they deserved better than to be forgotten, reduced to footnotes in history books that focus on walls and cannons and emperors. These were women who chose a life of devotion, discipline, and prayer, who educated themselves, who served their communities, who built their entire existence around faith and vows they held sacred. And in a single day, all of it was taken. May their memory be eternal. If this documentary opened your eyes to documented history that textbooks don't teach, subscribe to this channel now. Every video here is based on verified primary sources, with complete citations in the description. No fabrications. No sensationalism. Just history told truthfully and respectfully. Comment below. Were you taught about what happened to religious women during medieval conquests? Did you learn this in school? Let me know what historical topics you want covered next. Share this video with anyone interested in Byzantine history, women's history, or the real human cost of conquest warfare. The nuns of Constantinople deserve to be remembered accurately. This is their true story.